Hi, welcome back to lab, and today we are going to learn about the skull. But before we get started, let me explain to you some terminology which we'll be using. This is the main part of the skull. There is a lower jawbone, the mandible, which is missing, which we'll talk about later. And when we are talking about looking at the skull, this is the anterior part of the skull, where your nose is and your eyeballs are. When we are looking at the undersurface of the skull, we always put anterior in a superior direction so that you can stay oriented at all times. So this area is called the undersurface of the skull. Then if we make a transverse cut through the skull, we can see the interior aspect of the skull, or what is called the floor of the skull. Notice I turned it once again so that anterior was in a superior direction. Now the part of the skull that was cut off is called the skull cap. And when you look at the skull cap, it is generally oval in shape, but if you notice, the anterior portion is a little bit narrower than the posterior portion. And so bones can be clearly identified on the external part of the skull cap as well as the internal part of the skull cap, and additionally on the lateral aspect, the floor of the skull aspect, and for some bones on the inferior aspect of the skull. And so this explains why, as I'm going through, we're going to have pictures from all of those views. So I suggest you pause and you look at them as we go along. So let's get started. So looking at the floor of the skull, perhaps you can notice that this part here is shallower, and then the middle part of the skull is deeper. And then as I continue posteriorly, this is even deeper. So it kind of goes like this to really deep. So this most anterior portion is the shallowest portion, and this is known as the anterior cranial fossa. So it's not formed by any one bone. There are multiple bones which are making up the anterior cranial fossa. So like on a quiz or a test, it's going to be super important if there's an arrow in this area to read the question, like, does it say name the bone, which would be give the name of the bone, or does it say name the area, which would be, for instance, the anterior cranial fossa. Moving posteriorly, this middle area is called the middle cranial fossa. Also want to point out that it's real important you write all three words. You can't just write middle fossa. And then the deepest area, which has this huge hole in the middle of it, this is called the posterior cranial fossa. Okay, so let's start learning about bones. And we are going to start anteriorly first, okay? And so it's showing a view as if the skull cap had not been cut off, in which case the most anterior portion here, like, is called the frontal bone. So frontal bone can be seen on the skull cap externally as well as internally. And the frontal bone is this whole area, which then goes down to the upper area of the orbit. If we continue in from the frontal section and go posteriorly on each side, where you are traveling now is to the parietal bone. So parietal bone, the vast majority of it is going to be on the skull cap, but usually we can still see part of it. Let me switch to this side because you clearly can see there's a suture line right here. So we do have some parietal bone visible on the skull itself. And if you were to take the parietal bone off, it's just this very flat, thin bone with no real projections on it. Now let's go just inferior to the parietal, posterior to the parietal bone, to the back of the head back here. And this is the occipital bone. And as you can see in the top left picture, there's one occipital bone and two parietal bones. And remember, there was only one frontal bone. And so whereas the junction of the parietal bones with the frontal bone was a straight line going across, the junction of the occipital bone with the parietal bone is an upside down V, as seen in that top left picture. And it's the occipital bone that also contains that huge hole of foramen that is clearly visible on both aspects when you're looking at the skull. Now, there are a couple of landmarks on the occipital bone. The first one is when we go to the back of the head. If you feel the back of your head, you can feel like this bony protuberance right in the mid-sagittal plane. And that is this structure right here called the external occipital protuberance. Turning to the undersurface of the skull, find the big hole and look at 10 and 2 as if you were driving a car with your hands at 10 and 2 o'clock. And what you'll notice is there are some bony protuberances right there. And these are called the occipital condyle. And so if you recall from when we learned about the vertebral column, we learned the first cervical vertebrae, the atlas, sat underneath the skull. And so the articular facets of the atlas are articulating with the occipital condyles of the occipital bone. And it's that articulation that lets you tilt your head and say yes. Okay, so that's it for the occipital bone. And now we're going to move to the temporal bone. So the temporal bone is just inferior to the parietal bone. So parietal bone's way up here, and the temporal bone is so named, you know, this is your temple area. And notice it also does have the opening, which is like where your ear is. So hopefully you can figure out where you are on your body now. If you were to take the temporal bone off, you can see that it has like this big fan-like area from which we have multiple different projections. You can see like there's a downward mountain, you can see a little spiky thing, and then you can see sort of a handle thing coming off of that. All right. So the first thing I want you to do is look on the side view, find the ear hole, go posterior and inferior. So on this picture, find the ear hole, go posterior and inferior. And now we are where that downward, upside down mountain is. And that is called the mastoid process. So find the ear hole, which we're going to name later on, go posterior and inferior. So the mastoid process is something you actually can feel. So your ear hole, go behind your ear and go below. So right about where your lobe of your ear, right behind that, you can feel that bony protuberance, and that's your mastoid process. Now for the next structure, let me go back to this picture. Find your mastoid process and go anterior. And you see the structure that's hanging down looking like an ice pick? That's where we're going next. And that little ice pick structure is called the styloid process of the temporal bone. And so now this is like the third or fourth bone we've had that has a styloid process. So on this one, it's broken off on that side so you couldn't see it, but over here's the mastoid process. And then right there, yes, I did find it with my finger. That is the styloid process and the mastoid process. Okay, so from the mastoid process, you go anterior, and you're just gonna go just a little bit towards the midline. Okay, so mastoid process out here, and then go a little bit anterior and towards the midline to find the styloid process. Continuing on, go back to the lateral view. Find the ear hole and go anterior this time, okay? And if you go anterior, there's a smooth, shallow depression, a fossa. So it's outlined here in that bottom picture. And this is where the mandible is going to articulate. On my particular model, they have a little piece of plastic sitting right in this fossa. All right. So from the side, it's very easy to see. If you have the mandible, that's where the mandible is going to articulate to form your temporal mandibular joint, temporal bone. Mandibular fossa of the temporal bone articulates with a structure in the mandible that we will learn shortly. From the undersurface of the skull, you can see that it's going to be here and here on the other side where it is not highlighted. And the last structure for the temporal bone is that ear hole. And that ear hole is called the external, because it's on the outside, acoustic, which means ear, hearing, meatus. So meatus is like the opening to a canal, or, okay. So this isn't a punched out foramen kind of thing. This is a pathway that's going to go internally through the temporal bone like a tunnel. So this is called, right there, the external acoustic meatus. Now the last thing is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So this is that anterior projection coming just anterior to the external acoustic meatus, and then you can see something going anteriorly. If you look at the picture on the right, you'll see it's not the entire structure. So it's not this entire, let me make it so you can see. All right, can you see this whole like handle thing sticking out here? Okay, so the handle is made from a process going anterior from the temporal bone and a process going posteriorly from this bone. So only this posterior part of it is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Okay. And that's it for the bones that you are going, the first set of bones from the skull, and we will continue on with more bones in a later video. Thank you for all your work, and I will see you again soon.